Greetings and welcome to this all-new episode of Let's Create Something with Trapcode TAO in After Effects. Today we're going to be creating this kind of a setup. So first we're going to create some kind of an orderly, structured brick wall with cool detailed texture or shaders. And then we're going to break it up into something that looks more of kind of an abstract structure. And then we're going to look at how we can fractally displace that to make it even more messed up. So I don't know that any client would look at something like that and say that's exactly what I want, but it's not the point here. As a means of experimentations, it's going to be a super good occasion for us to look at a few techniques that I use in Trapcode TAO, and so we're going to recreate this step by step. They are working on the alarms in my apartment block right now, so we might hear some background alarm noises. I will try to fix that in post. But anyway, let's start this and let's open up a new project in After Effects and let's see. Probably not going to get the exact same result, as there has been a lot of scrambling with the properties while this was being created, but let's try to do it something along those lines. So first of all, let me talk about this cool resource here. It's a library that was made available by Randomizing. It's from Pixar. I think it's pretty well-known, established company. They've created this back in 1993, and they are all tiling, repeating textures, so we can use them. In 2017, they updated it, and they've added 16-bit bump roughness and normal maps. So pretty good resource for us Taoists to use if we want to make our materials look a little bit more rich and have a little bit more detail. So I'll show you how to set that up. So let's create a new solid, and we're going to start by creating something square, so 1080 by 1080, and let's hit OK. Just make sure that I have a long enough duration here. I'm going to set it up to 1200 frames to start, and let's hit Control Y to create a new solid. Doesn't matter what color we put on this, but let's hit Control Shift Y to get back in this solids setting, and we might want to call it Tau. So let's apply Tau on that, and we're gonna try to keep it simple in this episode. We're gonna try to look at other ways to animate our objects, other means of doing it other than using the offset path property here. And we're also going to keep it simple by using the automatically generated path. So we're going to set this as a line, and let's start to create our first row of bricks. So first we might want to give them 4 sides. So right now they are a triangle extrusion. First we can repeat the n-gons, so we have several pieces repeated here along our path, and let's reduce the amount of segments. Right now we can start. Let's make something with 8 bricks. So now they're pretty wide. We can reduce their size here, or we can simply reduce their size on the Z. And let's add one side here so they become more like squares. So let's make sure that we get something that kind of looks like bricks there. And yeah, let's start with that. So right away we're gonna apply our normal texture. So once you download this library here, I'll put the link in the description below. You can get it and check it out for yourself. So there's a bunch of folders in here. These are categories, so let's make it a marble texture, and all of these are grouped by 3. So we have this one that I use, I think it's a GLD marble, gold marble, and just grab these 3, they all go together. This one has a different name, so we want to grab this group of 3 and just drag it there in the project panel, and then we have them. We can bring them in the composition. For the moment, we don't need to pre-comp them, but maybe we'll do so if we need to do it. So let's apply the material. So let's go down to not material and lighting, but down in the texture section, and right here first we have the color texture. So let's see, we're gonna set this one is the normal, this one is the roughness, which we don't really have in TAO, but we can still use that as a spec map. But first, let's set that to this one. This is the texture. So this is by default what we'll get here. It's gonna look the same on each one of our bricks there. So we can stretch the texture until we get something that looks a little bit more even. And it's the same on each one, so the repetition is pretty noticeable. What we can do to make it more random here is we have this right in the segment section here, we have this X texture along the path here. So we can just change these numbers here a little bit, and as long as they differ, it's gonna make it different on each brick. So that's easily how we can make it immediately look random. Then if we leave it at 0 and 0, it's going to be the exact same part of the texture that's on each brick. So we don't want that. Let's put other numbers there. Cool. That's only the texture. So that's without the texture, and that's with the texture we've applied. Now we're going to apply the normal map. So let's see. Let me just turn off the texture for the moment, and this is only the normal applied. So as you can see, it's not colored anymore, but we have some kind of displacement going on. It looks detailed and all, and we can set it to linear. Not that's gonna change anything for that, but let's get down to the rendering, and we might wanna use super sampling for that. So when we use normal textures, it's going to be a little bit noisy here with the multi-sample. But we can also increase this value here. So it's by default it's at 8. Let's try 16, and already it kind of fixes it a little bit. Let's try 32. It's the same. So 16 multi-sample here would be something that we can work with, or 60. Yeah, it's a little bit more blurry for that. I don't know that you can see the difference, but at least let's keep it at 16 multi-sample for the moment. And the normal also gets the same offsetting here as the texture, and it also gets the same offset along the path. So it gets the same randomization. It's gonna follow our texture. So when both of them are applied together, we're gonna have the possibility to get more detail. Now it doesn't look already more detailed. If I look at the difference, this is just the texture, and this is with the normal map. Here is the strength of the normal map. We can increase it here, and look at those creases there. We definitely have a little bit more of the details, and the ambient occlusion will interact with that. So let's get down to the rendering here, and right to the ambient occlusion. Let's turn it off. So that's going to be our shadow interacting with the normal material here into the little creases there, and it's also interacting where our geometry pieces encounter each other. It's going to make some kind of a shadow in the creases and all that. So you have some settings here that allows you to increase it, or let's decrease the strength here in the normal. Let's try something like that. And so depending on the kind of content that you're working with, you might want to accentuate the effect of ambient occlusion to get more shadow. I don't want to touch the multi-sample here, but you can mess around until you get the kind of result that you want. But really the normal mapping here is going to really interact more if we have SIBL lighting or any light objects in there. So let's put some lighting right away. we're gonna use a custom SIBL in this episode. So let's go in the material and lighting, and we have in the image-based lighting here, we have some built-ins here that we can use. That's gonna automatically show what I'm talking about in terms of how the reflections and how the light is gonna hit on those bumpy areas. So right there, but let's use our own. So sometimes you have your own image. So let's use this one. It's a 360 equirectangular photo I took while I was at a restaurant, and look at that. There is a small statue of a little kid with a Montreal Canadiens shirt. I hope this is not considered as child pornography. Let's import that. So let's bring this image. You can use any image you want. I'm gonna put this one for you to use. I'm gonna put a link for this one so you will be able to use it as you follow along with this tutorial. So it's not even high dynamic range. This one usually we use EXRs and that have high dynamic range, but we can still get away with a simple JPEG. So let's first drag it on the comp icon here so we can create a composition out of it, and we're gonna call this reflection, and let's make a diffusion map out of that. Look at this guy in the kitchen. Is there any chance that this guy knew that he was going to be part of a Trapcode TAO episode? Let's pick up our reflection composition that we've just created and drag it up to the composition icon here to create a composition out of that. And this one we're gonna rename it diff for diffusion. Now this diffusion, we don't need it to be that big, so the composition size is 5,000 pixels wide. So let's make sure that the lock aspect ratio is checked, and let's set the height to 200, so it should be 400 by 200, twice as large as it is tall. And then our comp is still pretty huge in there, so we're gonna hit Control Alt F, and that's gonna resize it. So we have the same ratio, so it should resize it at the size that we want. And then we're gonna apply a fast blur onto that. So the diffusion is just some light information, and we want to check the repeat edge pixels here. And perhaps it's a good idea, but I'm not sure that this is quite necessary, but I'm hitting Alt and clicking on the number here to set the project to 32 bits per channel. And what I suggest doing at this step here, so this is going to be our diffusion map, and it's going to use that composition, that resized composition, to generate some lighting data for our scene. So we don't want to necessarily calculate the big image and calculate the fast blur while we're using this image to generate that. So what I suggest doing at this step is just making I'm hitting B and N right here to export one frame of that as a high dynamic range image. So we're gonna hit Control Shift front slash to add it in the render queue, and let's save it just as a Photoshop output. It's going to be a PSD, and since we're in 32 bits, it's going to have all data. And let's set this to output. Let's export that. Let's hit render, and it shouldn't take long because it's just one frame. And let's re-import that. So I have the diff here. I just double click in the project panel, and I'm going to re-import it. I'm just gonna come back into the same comp that we exported, that was created, that we created, and then we're gonna drag this here and shut this down. We don't need it anymore. So instead of calculating the super big resized image plus the fast blur, it's gonna have it already integrated in there. Logically, that should save us a little bit of render time and potentially prevent some crashes. So let's get back in our composition here. And now that we have our reflection and diffusion composition, we can select both of them and bring them in the timeline here. And let's get back to our TAO solid, and let's get down to the SIBL, Smart Image Based Lighting section, image based lighting. So we're not going to use the built-in environment. We're going to feed it a reflection environment map. So that's going to be our reflection. And then we're going to put the diffused. So that's going to be diff there. So now it looks pretty noisy. Now we might want to set it to super sample. So it's going to make it a little bit blurry, but yeah, these are two things that really tends to get more and more noisy as we keep it in multi-sampling. So this is this would be at default. I mean, as soon as we use this, it adds up some noise in there depending on the amount of color data that you have. And since we don't have much, we're just going to be safe either by increasing this value here. Let's try 32. Doesn't seem to make any difference. So in this case, using the normal map, we need to crank it this to 16 instead of the default 8. And if in addition to that we're using SIBL, I greatly suggest that we set it to super sample, even though we're gonna lose a little bit of sharpness there, but we should still get some pretty nice light reaction in this detailed texture. So let's see. Right now we're at the default settings for the diffusion, so this is something that we can increase to increase the light. So that's based on our image here. So it's gonna reflect the colors that were in that restaurant scene, and the reflection we can turn it down. I don't know that rocky. So this kind of gives a super nice organic kind of aspects to our bricks there, and it's not as detailed as it would be in a 3D software, and we can increase the expose environment. But it gives us something nice to work with and experiment with super quick render time. So that's why I want to show it to you. And of course, it also looked more detailed with some light hitting it, so we can add up light objects in addition to our image-based lighting. But for that, we have to make sure. But not necessarily we have to make sure, but it's good practice to check in the include TAO Lumi lights, and when we create our lights, so Control Shift Alt L, we call it TAO Lumi, all in caps, make it a point light, and default settings, hit OK. We should get an additional light object. Now I'm hitting Control Shift H to hide and reveal the layer controls here, so I'm going to grab up this light object, and I can move it around and make the light hit the brick and have some glows there. So depending on what we're looking to create in terms of light. So this one is pretty close to the object. The basic idea was more to pull it back a little bit. So if we put it on this side, it accentuates the light direction coming from this side. So if we want a top light, and if we drag it on this side, it's all gonna react with these tiny little details here on how the light direction is set up by none other than you, based on your preference. So let's set this one here, and of course we can add some color on these lights. Now it's pure white, but if we want to shade a little bit of a part of our brick with some red light, maybe that's something for a reason that we would want to do, then we can do that, and we can decrease the radius of this. So let's make it a little close, and so that's one way that we could have this kind of detail on our brick there. So we can duplicate this light object, and we can bring it elsewhere, and we can, I'm hitting quickly twice on A to open up the light options, and let's increase the intensity on this one, increase the size maybe, make it different color, and that allows us to play around. So I'm gonna make it more of a general top light. So combined with our image-based lighting, that allows us a little bit more control on the light. Great, we're still starting this. It's still at beginning steps, but look at how far we're going already with the simple geometry. Yeah, one other thing, with the light fall off here, by default it's not active, but if we set that to smooth, then I don't know that it's gonna be. Let's increase the intensity of those lights here to show more what I'm talking about. So this is pretty wide of an area that our light hits the object, but if we set the light radius smaller there, and so we can go halfway on how the light is spreading, and of course it also depends of the light position in the scene. So maybe now that we've done that, we can bring this. So that's something also you can mess around with in the end if you feel that your light is hitting too far on the object. And then again, there is no like wrong or right doing in that. It's most of the time it's gonna be the numbers you're gonna put there is gonna be different based on what you have in there. So based on the scale of your objects, and then the diffusion, the general diffusion intensity, we can control with that. So lots of options that we have here, and we can give it more of a metallic aspect. So that'll change how the reflection happens. We can increase the reflection, make it super bright, and now we can decrease that, and we can increase the Fresnel, so that'll make the reflection happen differently depending on the angle that our object is facing in relation to our camera. So lots of options. Oh yeah, let's get back in our texture. Now that we've set it up, we've got some light, we've got some ambient occlusion, we've got some texture, normal displacement. Let's add a specular map. So we've got the roughness that we can use for that. So let's choose the roughness and let's see what we get out of that. Not much should change, but let's look at that more in detail. So we're gonna pre-comp this one. So we're gonna pre-comp the roughness, and let's hit Control-Shift-C. This panel is gonna be brought up. So let's leave all the attributes in comp 1. We're gonna hit OK, and this will now have a composition. Let's double click on it. So that's what we've got there. I'm just gonna lock this down and create a new comp viewer here so we can keep this this one on the left here, and I'm gonna apply a level effect on that image. So I'm gonna come back in the previous comp, and then what I forgot to do here is to lock this down, so I want to keep it as I go back, and then we can either invert that first. So let's fetch our invert effects. So the areas that are bright will get more reflection, more of the reflection, and the areas that are dark will get no reflection at all. So imagine that this is following where our texture is applied on our bricks there. The black parts won't be reflective as much as the white parts. So let's try to increase the contrast on that to make it super obvious, and then we can judge if we need it or not, or if we need it to be on this or on the opposite. Let's hit F3. So now we've kept this locked here. We can bring it on top here, and since I had this layer chosen and I hit F3, now I can view my Tau effect at the same time and still keep this curve up there. And just want to make sure that the specular map is there, and we're not seeing any changes yet, not until we force refresh it. So I'm going to hit Control-Alt-/ on the numpad here, and it's going to make the refresh. So one thing that that's not pretty convenient when we purge the memories that we can't compare with picture we take. So Shift F8 to grab a picture. If we purge, it's gonna delete that, so we can quick compare. So let's compare by turning it off simply. So it doesn't bring much. It doesn't bring much, the roughness in this particular situation. Really not that much. So let's invert that and let's see again, refresh. So let's look at with the spec and without. So it seems to be canceling a little bit of the reflection on some parts and not on other. In the end, it's gonna make it seem a little bit richer. So we might want to keep it on or just remove it completely if we judge it's not necessary to our scene. Alright, so now that's what we've got. It's still a pretty orderly, pretty structured row of brick. Let's repeat it so we can make some kind of a wall out of that. So we're gonna repeat that. So first we might want to repeat that vertically. We might just need one repeater group to do that. So let's uncheck the symmetric doubling, and perhaps we can even leave it on for that. And let's increase the amount of repetition. So let's start with 2. Not a big number. And by default, it's repeating it on the X. So we want to set this back to down to 0. And let's repeat it on the Y. And once again, I'm sorry for these alarm noises. They're probably going to mess up all my recording, but that's what I have to deal with today. It's not my fault. Sorry, I'm going to try to edit this. Alright, so now we've repeated our path. Now we can get some kind of a wall, a brick wall there, and we might want to offset this in order to get more, in order to alternate, like usually they don't put one brick exactly on top of each other, but rather halfway through. It makes more solid walls like that, I think, but usually it's gonna be half the size of what our brick is. So let's look at that in our segment. The size X, no, it's not the size X, it's the size Z. So our brick is 61. Let's make it 60 wide, and we want to make it we want to offset it 60 pixels. Yeah. All right. So we've got some offsets there, and we can keep it up. So since we have the symmetric doubler, it's gonna repeat it downwards and upwards. It's not gonna be symmetrical for the position offset. So if we want to fill up the gaps now, we're gonna use the second repeater for that. So let's open up this, twirl this down, and uncheck that, and let's start with 1 repetition, and let's see where that gets us. We're gonna shut it off on the Y, and let's simply offset this on X, and let's simply come and bring it just to close the gap there. And we don't necessarily need it to be that precise, as long as it feels right. And if we check this in, it'll fill the hole on the other spot as well. So pretty cool. And let's turn off this for a moment. And one thing that I forgot to mention, well, 2 things. Let's look at 2 issues that we have now. Now, when we repeat our segments on our line there, we've done something to prevent the repetition on the texture, to make it that each brick is not exactly the same, is not presenting the same area of the texture. But now, as we repeat it, it's also got the same arrangement of randomness. Each row is the same, so we have to scramble this also. in the repetition. So this is the first repeater. We have here R1 texture offset X. So let's mess around with that. And immediately on the X there is going to make and sort that each row is not exactly the same. And let's also make it on the Y. So this texture is tiling, so of course there's gonna be inevitably some areas that, like some spots that you can recognize, but they'll not be evenly distributed around all the areas, the area of our wall, so that won't be necessarily that noticeable. We'll get this feeling of randomness in there. So that's the R1 texture, offset X and offset Y properties here. So that's going to allow us to get even more randomness. All right, so that's our wall. Let's bring this back. So we just need one level of repetition for that, and we can also, we might want to also offset the texture on this there, and see it's just affecting the brick patch there and there. And let's zoom out a little bit. So we're gonna add a camera to our scene. So Control Alt Shift C, and let's make it 50 millimeters, the default settings for an After Effects camera. Let's hit OK, and let's already create a null object. So Control Shift Alt Y, simply so we can make it 3D and connect the camera to it, so we can work with that as a dolly. And let's hit C to cycle through our camera tools in the viewport there, and let's zoom out so we have more of a wider area of the brick wall that we can look at. All right, interesting. Now we might want to move our Lumi lights, as we can obviously see that they are big spots now, and let's bring them more on the sides there, so we get some spills but not the area which is too bright. And maybe we can duplicate this one once more and bring it back towards the center and pull it back, so we get some lighting but not as much on a wider area. Something like that, something like that. Now we might want to tone it down a little bit and to make its radius a little wider. So really, just positioning these lights, we can get some more variations here and make it look less even on the lighting. Next, let's make it a little bit more random than that in terms of our actual bricks. So now we've randomized the texture. It looks a little bit different on each one. Let's save that. Tutorial. Many ways that we can randomize our brick, but let's use the quickest and easier one. So we're going to random this section right into the segment section, and this is something that I don't use that often because it's got its advantages and its disadvantages, obviously. But let's start playing in with that, and let's see what we can get. So first, we can alter, like we can increase that to increase the random X position on the bricks, and randomize the Y also. So automatically, like, let's keep this first one at 0, and let's like automatically we can see these rows are pulling out and some are pulling in, and let's change the Z position. So yeah, another I'm jumping from one subject to another. It's because I forgot also, and we're noticing this because I'm displacing those bricks towards us right now. But now that these are out, look at the caps. They're the way the texture is applied on the caps is by default is gonna it's something that's called, let's look at it in texture. It's it's set to fan here. So that's a fan. And we just want to make sure that it's set to full there. So we've got a little bit less control on how the texture is applied on the caps, but at least we can set it, we cannot stretch it. So as we change these numbers there and the offset there, oh, sorry for that, it won't change the texture fully applied on the caps, but I guess we can still work this out. And yeah, but let's get back to the randomness. So the bricks are randomized, but they are randomized the same on each repetition, because remember, we're repeating that. Maybe that's one thing that we want, because we actually want to make some kind of pattern like that. But maybe we want each repetition to have a different randomization. So to do that, we just need to make sure that the unique seeds, when repeated, is activated. I think that the word unique, it needs a U. It needs U in between the Q and the E. But that will make it sort basically that more randomization will be noticeable. Like each brick will have a different offset. So that's more of a way that we can randomize here the pattern. So let's change that as well a little bit, not as much. Position Z, and let's make it more random. So before we make it random, let's set up some keyframes. So we're gonna be wanting to, or maybe like a little bit of we're gonna morph this brick wall, this orderly and structured brick wall, into something that's really more abstract and fractally and doesn't have completely perfect square pieces anymore. So, but we want to bring it back to this state in an animation. So let's create our initial keyframes. We can add all of those aside from the random seed. This one we don't want to. We want to make sure that we don't animate it. So nice, we have a keyframe on all that. Let's hit U, and that'll reveal them in the timeline. Let's copy that and let's paste that on our last frame that we want for our loop. So let's make it 90 frames in this case, and I'm gonna copy those. So Control C and Control V. So those keyframes are now repeated over there, and let's get right in between. So on frame 45, and that's where we're gonna scramble things up. So while we're here, now we're gonna change these numbers even more. So let's do that. Random position Z, and then we can rotate them. So let's rotate them a little bit on the X, on the Y, on the Z. Let's randomize their scale, and let's randomize their scale X and this scale Y and scale Z, so that's going to make them more unproportionally scaled. They're not going to be all squares. Some of them are going to be thin rectangles. Some of them are going to be fat rectangles. We're going to get more variation. And since we've created keyframes at the beginning and at the end, we'll get the interpolation in between those changes as we ramp review our animation. And it's going to loop because it's going from this initial point to the morph and back to this initial point. So if we close down the work area on frame 89 here, just by hitting N on the keyboard, and keep up with the ramp preview there. So that's the type of animation that we'll get there. Pretty cool. Now, as you can see, I have the green line is not entirely filled up. This is usually what I do for ramp preview. If you can see here, ramp preview options. So shift ramp preview options. This is, I hit shift 0 on the numpad for the ramp preview, and it does skip one frame. So it has one less frame to render to give me my preview, but it's one less frame to see. And then if I hit 0 only, then as you can see, it's going back to fill up those gaps. And now if I need to see all the frames, it takes twice the time, but it gives a more fluid preview. But I tend to use the shift 0 pretty often because it allows me to view the preview a little bit faster. So cool, we've got this nice morphing action. Now maybe we're not directly satisfied with how it looked like the randomization. Maybe it's not exactly how we would want it to be. Now is the time to look what other seeds will bring us. So if we change that, we can scramble through different results that are based on the specific changes that we've applied here. So maybe this the way it's disposed right now, it's kind of better. And let's come to the ambient occlusion. Right now would be a good time to see if we need a little bit more. So increasing the intensity and increasing the lift. And let's hit undo and undo. Let's grab a picture. So Shift F8 before we play around with those. And let's now drag those and try to find values that are somewhat pretty nice. So let's look back at what we had. And if I compare both, I think that this one looks much more, it has a little bit more depth. It might be a little bit grainy as we zoom in, but this depends on the type of ambient occlusion setting that we put up here. If you can get away with setting it only to on, set it to on, but sometimes you'll need to, as I look at that, I think that it's pretty cool to get this amount of details just in After Effects with Trapcode TAO and the normal materials. And again, it's not at the level of realism that you would get with a traditional 3D software, but to render something like that would take up ages compared to how fast we can get it out of After Effects only with Trapcode TAO. Anyway, so now we've done that. We've got a nice wall. The wall is morphing into a less structured wall, more a chaotic wall. Let's make it even more chaotic. So what else? What else could we do here? Let's get back in the repeat path and let's see if we do rotate the world rotate X from the first repeater, we can kind of twist that whole pack of bricks into something that looks more like some kind of a spiraling thing. But yeah, we can keyframe that. So let's open up this and let's go to frame 45. So 15. Let's hit it, the stopwatch here, and let's go back to 0. See, now they're all ordered, but it's like staircase. Awesome. But let's set this back to 0. So back to our wall. And let's go to the end and also make sure that we've set it back to 0 as well. So now let me just save this. And if we shift 0 for the skip it in one frame on the ramp preview, and look at that. It's going to interpolate between our kind of flatly non-twisted brick wall to some kind of a rotated, twisted, randomly distorted brick wall. So that's something that can be interesting right there. And we're gonna even more increase that even more the feeling of randomness by adding some fractal displacement. So we're not using the offset animation. We're just gonna keyframe the amplitude of this, and we're gonna make it rise as it twists. So let's look at what we'll get doing that. So let's start by increasing that. So right away, look at how our bricks are not squared anymore. They're more like chunk. They look more like rocks, and we can even increase the oct scale there too, and increase the frequency. So depending on what we put down there, and then we'll simply animate the amplitude. So let's once again hit the stopwatch while we're at frame 45. I'm gonna hit U to reveal all that, and here's our last one we've added. Let's get to 0, and let's put 0. So look at our wall now. Even when it's flat and it's fractally displaced, it looks pretty cool. So let's set that to 0. And as it animates, it's gonna also morph our bricks to something that's more fractally displaced. And let's put even more emphasis on that. Getting all chunky. And now we can perhaps also get in the individual amplitude and frequency. So sometimes there is one of those numbers that you just want to shut off and set down to 0. But let's see if it's the case for that. Let's try one after the other. So maybe right now I can tell that I want a little bit less stretching on this axis. So the amplitude Y, I'm gonna half it down. And let's try to set this down to 0. So yeah, that would be some kind of a different results of displacing. And also for the frequency, we can independently on each axis set what kind of a frequency we would like. So that's something. So we can look at the animation of that, and it looks pretty great. And once again, I don't know that any clients would simply look at that and say, yes, that's what I need for my project. But the goal here is just to wander around and look at what exactly is possible to create with Trapcode TAO, and ultimately bring this in some other direction. If looking at this gives you more ideas, well, that's the point. Go ahead and do it. Experiment. Get further. This is not the limit. I'm not showing you the further we can get using this technique. I'm just like opening the door of the lobby and showing you the lobby around, and up from this point it's up to you. If it gives you, perhaps it's triggering some idea, and oh, you didn't know that you can use this feature of TAO in that way, but now that you've seen this, it makes you want to try this thing, or it makes you want to, gives you this idea. So just open After Effects and set it up, put it together, and perhaps even while doing that, you'll harvest more ideas out of, like, you'll set it up, you'll mess around with some keyframes, you'll animate some properties, you'll make some mistakes, and you'll try to fix those mistakes, and you'll learn more stuff by doing that. So I'm just showing you one of the many possible ways, but there's nothing really final or definitive in there. It's just a suggestion of some path to follow. You don't necessarily don't have to follow it and put the exact same numbers that I'm putting there. So I hope that's something you can understand. And let's add ourselves a little background on there. So I'm gonna hit Control Y to make a new solid. Let's call it BG, and let's bring it at the bottom of the stack, and we're simply gonna make a ramp there. make a ramp. And on this ramp, we're gonna apply something that is called a tritone effect. And basically, it's gonna allow us to add 3 colors to our ramp. So maybe we want a sky. The sky is gonna be the black part. So we want some kind of a reddish sky, and at the bottom we want it to be more the right. I'm not hitting the right one. So this we want it to make some more towards the blue, something like that. And then the middle part is kind of a orange sunsetty setting maybe. And that's just a suggestion here. And then we can pick up the ramp, and let me hit Control Shift H to reveal the layer controls there, and we can play around with those 2 start and end points, and our tritone will respond to that accordingly. So right away we can get something that looks not that bad. And then once we've got that, we kind of get some, kind of want to maybe pull out some of the background color back into our object. So with the visibility setting here, let's grab this color there, this kind of a brownish orange, and that's going to be our far distance. So let's see how far this goes in terms of just the far distance. Let's bring this value back until we start to cut our thing. So right there. So this is also a super easy way to animate some reveal of something. Maybe imagine we just animate the far property from 920 here, and we're gonna construct this like that. So it's not the best way to do that, but it's pretty easy. Anyway, let's just bring it right close to the limit. We still want to see all of our object, but we just don't want to render that far for no reason. And now that we've done that, let's bring our fog start. Now we know that this value has to be smaller than this number, and we know that the fog end got to be something close to this number. So something around this value, we can copy and paste this there, and already you can see it kind of comes in bleeding right there into our object. So I know that ultimately it would be more ideal if we could have this be a gradient and the exact same gradient as that. So the fog would be kind of more of a bluish nature close to here, and it would be more reddish there. But that's not something that we're gonna be doing in this. And what did I move here? So that's the line. So that's, since we're using the line here, can still animate those here, stuff that we wouldn't be able to do with light objects. So let me just move this around there. Looks nicer, I think. So right there, we're distorting our brick wall. Maybe we want a little bit more blue coming up from down there, so we can cheat it up by duplicating this Lumi light here on top that we've got. Let's bring it down there, and let's set it to some kind of a blue shade that's close to that kind of blue. So let's start playing like that, and ultimately we've got to find the perfect location for this light. So let's pull it more towards that side, and I'm gonna just do it quick here, so it's not gonna be quite perfect, but just some additional way of adding more, once again, more light details, a little bit more richness onto this. Not that it's gonna make it look entirely realistic, but it's gonna make it a little bit nicer. All right, so pretty interesting kind of a setup there. Let's add the final stage of color correction. So right now we've got some fair amount of details in there, and we've got the way light reacts to it. It's pretty interesting, and it still needs that last finish feel. So let's add some adjustment layer and color correction, basic color correction. So what I would suggest usually is that you work this way. You render this flat colored clip, and then on the rendered sequence you add the color correction. But Trapcode TAO is pretty powerful, and we might just save this step by color correcting right here in our edit comp. So let's do that. Sometimes it might crash with the curves. This happens sometimes to me, but not every time. But let's start by adding a level, a basic level that we're gonna apply on all that. So let's look at each of our channels independently. So let's look at our red, and we're gonna have this kind of a graph here, as we can pull the left side and the right side. So usually what I do is, not that it's a rule that is entirely, doesn't work every time, but sometimes you'll get areas on the right and on the left where it's near to the ground, like this. Imagine this is kind of a hill. Like what I start by doing usually is just pulling the left and the right arrows close to where the start of the hill is. So right now it's not a pretty good example for that, but let's look at the other channel. So right here, the green, this on the right here, it goes all the way, but if you can notice here, not that we can zoom on this graph, but the last part of it is clearly not really rich in green, so the highlights there. So we can pull this in, but it automatically becomes too green for my taste once again. So let's pull this back, and what it does is kind of just enriches the whole thing. So let's go see the blue, and let's bring this up, and let's bring this one back. So it kind of tones everything together, and now if we compare, it looks much more appealing. I mean, more vibrant that way. And then on top of that, let's add a curve layer, and the curves, we're going to use it to increase the contrast here. So maybe we want a more light, and let's tone this down. So really, depending on what you want to do here. And we could add a vignette to that. So right now I'm looking at this, and let's simply add a vignette to that. So I'm going to hit Control Y to add another colored solid, and the color, I'm going to pick it up from the sky here, the darker color from the sky, and I'm going to put it even darker. So right in between there, on top of everything. And we're going to set the mode of that layer to multiply. So that kind of going to make the blending work differently. So right now, let's keep it all dark like that. 88 on the opacity. The shortcut is T for opacity. So the trick to remember that is T for transparency. So let's add a mask to that solid. So we're going to select the ellipse tool, and simply, while we have the dark red solid selected, let's double click on the circle here, and let's check in the inverted box here, and we're gonna quickly twice tap on M on the keyboard, and we're gonna do that twice, so we're gonna have access to the mask properties. So we can add more feather, and right now this looks much too even for what I would like. So let's simply make this circle more irregular, and there's no, like, there are some rules that you can make for yourself to follow. So let's say that the light in this now, what we've it seems to come from the top there. So we might want to leave out the dark on top of this corner since the light is coming from on top there. But this area looks like it might be shadowed by the others, so we can make it darker here and on all the way to the edge right there, and right down here. It can also benefit from darker spots, and I'm gonna hit Control Shift H to hide that. So ideally, sometimes it kind of looks crappy to add a vignette, but ideally it's just to make the focus more. And let's increase the opacity. And let's try it. Maybe the color isn't right, so now it's some kind of a dark red based on this color. Let's try to make something, some kind of a blue one. See what it brings us. Not much more. So that maybe not quite that good of an idea. So doesn't always work as intended. But then again, if we bring it under the color correction, it's for you to decide what's looks best. For the moment, I can't quite get sure for myself, but yeah, that's a simple vignette. And on top of that, we can add some fake rays of light, maybe, to put more emphasis on our light direction. So it seems that we would have some kind of a strong beam that is coming from up there. So let's pick up the pen tool, and let's make sure that we don't have any layer selected, and we can shut down the stroke for this, and let's make it the color. We want to pick up some color from this right there, and let's make some kind of a conic shape coming just like it if it was a cheap beam coming from up there. And let's set this layer to add, and let's add a fast blur to that, and let's add some blurriness. So right now it's pretty strong. Let's reduce the opacity. So that's something that we can work with to fake some additional light. It's not always the best solution, but what's cool about it is that if you hit Y, here is our center point here. It's around the point that this thing will rotate, so we just bring it up there close to the narrow part here, and if we rotate that, so I'm hitting R on the layer there, it's going to rotate from this angle up there. So it can be some way to add fake lighting, post lighting, additional lighting. So sometimes it's increase the impression of lighting. That sometimes it's not the result that you want, but it's something that you can do. And let's come here. Let's try a different color for that. So right now we can add in more color, especially if we want to get some light, some colored light bleed in. So once again, we can simply add a wiggle on the rotation now, and let's now I've hit Alt and click on the stopwatch here, and now I'm typing down wiggle. Let's start by twice per second, and comma to the range of 60 degrees, let's say, and close parentheses, semicolon. So that's gonna make our beam of light rotate. So I'm gonna just solo that. So it's going quite too far, and it's quite fast. So let's put 0.67, and let's see. Now it's going too far on this side. we can manually rotate it back. So we can do that, try to center it, and we can decrease the amplitude. So let's make it 30 degrees of a rotation instead, and let's aim like this. So hey, don't go up there. We can change the seed of this wiggle if we're not satisfied. So seed random, let's just type that in there, and let's type a random number in there. So we're gonna get a different motion out of this. So you can combine different cones of light with different opacities, and let's try a different number. It's always going there, over there, and this is it. So let's rotate it 10 degrees, not that much. Yeah, it's gonna stay around this area. And if we want that loop, since our animation is 90 frame, we're gonna get the formula we use pretty often, Dan Ebert. So right there, I'm gonna put the link in the description down below, so we can copy this patch of code here, which is going to make our wiggle loop. So let's select the wiggle here, and over that, we're gonna simply paste the patch code there. The loop time by default is set to 3. That's exactly what I need. It's the equivalent of 90 frames. And the amplitude we wanted was something like 12, frequency 0.67. And now, instead of having just a normal wiggle, it's gonna loop. It's gonna come back to its initial position. So as this plays along and come back to the beginning, we're not gonna see any tilt or any skip or anything. Is going to be seamless. So that's exactly what we want. We can also copy that, and let's hit T, and let's add that to the opacity. So I'll click on the stopwatch for the opacity, and we might want to change the seed there. And this one we're going to make it really quick, so 5 times for the frequency, an amplitude of 42. Let's start with that. And what is this going to make it flash? But now the amplitude is too much. Now let's increase this. Okay. So now it's gonna wiggle the opacity of this cone of light, so it's gonna make it flash. And on top of everything, it's gonna add a little bit more light details. And one additional thing that we can do that I should have shown you when we were at the smart image-based lighting step is that, where is it? So let's close down the fractal. Let's get in the material and lighting. So the rotate environment. So that's the angle from our SIBL, and look at that. This is a rotation of 360 degrees, and look at how it changes the light aspect. Look, this is 76 degrees, and this is at 0 degrees. So really, we're getting different light direction from that. So we might want to either wiggle that or make it a full 360 revolution from the beginning to the end of our animation to see what we get out of that. Let's try it out. So let's make a keyframe on frame 0 with the rotate environment at 0, and let's go to frame 90 there, and let's put 360. So now as we go through it, and I sincerely hope I've crashed it. Did I save? So I did pick it up from a few steps prior to. I think we don't have the light yet, so let's just shut off the color correction adjustment layer for the moment. I feel that the curve is really what's making it crash sometimes. not always. But we still have our beam of light. It is still rotating, and it is still flashing. I'm so happy that I have this kind of Twitch habit to always hit Control S, and that makes it really useful to not lose the entirety of the project sometimes. But where were we? Right. To the material and lighting and rotate environment. So let's add a keyframe on frame 0, and let's add a keyframe. Go to frame 90, and let's make it 360. And where's our? I want to this light. I just want to make sure that it's not standing right there when the wall is closed. So we're gonna keyframe its position. So let's hit P. So at frame 45, we do want it there, but right from this part there. So at frame 90, we want it perhaps to move it down there, and we won't see the update. So let's force refresh it, and then that makes it a little bit more sense. We want the blue hitting from this side, but not flatly on the wall when it's close. Like it's gonna make this big round area. We're gonna cancel that. So the light is gonna move at the same time that we do our animation. Cool. All right. So that's pretty much all that I wanted to show you today. I hope that this session is going to trigger many ideas, and that you're going to want to experiment more stuff using Trapcode TAO and figuring out what else is possible to do with this super amazing software. And that if you post anything, you can hit me up on Twitter, on the social networks. I'd be really curious to see that, as I always like to see what others are creating through their experimentations with Trapcode TAO. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.